Good evening, welcome to MOTS presents MOTS Ado About Nothing.
MOTS Ado About Nothing. MOTS Ado About Nothing.
Where we apply the revolutionary MOTS scale to classic and contemporary literature.
MOTS Ado About Nothing. MOTS Ado About Nothing.
This podcast contains mature content, spoilers, language. You have been warned.
And welcome back to another episode of MOTS Ado About Nothing, Halloween special, MOTS Halloween 2016, and or MOTS Ado About MOTS Halloween, if you will. Any combination thereof that you prefer. I, of course, am Captain Obed Marsh, a.k.a. Scott Thurlow, joined tonight by Old Zadok himself, Jane Manzer.
I can't quite hear the call of Cthulhu.
And Joe Sargent, bus driver, a.k.a. Chris Morgan.
And I don't have that Innsmouth look.
Not yet, you don't. And as you may have gathered, we're doing tonight, the story selection is The Shadow over Innsmouth by Howard Philip Lovecraft. Some of you may have heard of him, some of you may not have, but he's certainly one of my favorite authors, and this is one of his most famous, if not tied with a couple others, famous stories, and we'll be reviewing this story shortly. So I've also come up with the logline, and for this one, I have got, this is a dawning of the age of Cthulhu, if that grabs ya. And then I will go into the folding the intro by the conclusion to one question. I will explain what happened, and we'll discuss. So it opens with basically allow me to, if you will, indulge me to give a brief, as brief as possible, sort of background history lesson on Lovecraft himself. He was sort of a reclusive guy, and also kind of elitist in certain senses, which we'll get into. So many of his stories, if not all, revolve around an unnamed character, unnamed narrator. This one is no exception, who's basically doing, how should I describe it? He doesn't have a job, really. He's on a tour for archaeological purposes and anthropomorphic studies, so he claims. And he comes upon, he's doing a little tour of New England as sort of like, even before King, most of, if not all, again, of Lovecraft stories are set in the New England area, since that's where he lived and never left. So this character is on his little tour, and he's stopping in certain towns here and there on the way, and he happens to come into a town, and on his sort of layover, if you will, to his next stop, he hears of a town called Innsmouth from the, I believe, the ticket keeper in the town, who's like, basically says to him, yeah, there's a town, like, Innsmouth is a known town, but people seem to avoid it, and no one knows exactly why, people won't say, but it sort of piques his interest, and he thinks it will be perhaps a fruitful journey to go there and study it, and he's heard there's some like pretty cool, buildings and so forth that he might be interested in, architecture that he might like to check out, and is informed that there is a sort of a rundown bus service. One guy who operates it runs a bus to Innsmouth from where he's staying, which I believe is Ipswich or something. Doesn't really matter. Like one of the more bigger XPs of towns that Lovecraft incorporated into his stories. Decides to go there. He stops over quickly at a library where he flirts with a mousy librarian real quickly, who shows him a artifact, a diadem, I believe it is, that has very strange and never before. He can't quite place where these designs on this artifact, on this little item, piece of jewelry are from. But again, sort of piques his interest, sort of gets him curious, and he would like to learn more about it. Decides to next day take the bus into Innsmouth and explore the town here and there. As he does so, he notices something is kind of off about the denizens of this town. They don't look quite right. They're sort of furtive, as I believe the description is used a number of times in this story. They have a weird, bizarre, half-human, uncanny look, if you will, channeling Freud a bit. So he starts to explore the town a bit more, starts to delve into that. He comes upon a church that's been repurposed. It's clearly not a Catholic church anymore, or at least a Christian church, or at least once was, but now is not. Starts hearing little rumors, like anyone who's willing to talk to him, just tells him, you probably shouldn't stay here too long, just something ain't right about this town, and good luck talking to the actual people. He runs into a grocery store clerk who is not an Innsmouth native, if you will, does not have the Innsmouth look, as Chris referenced. And he sort of gets pointed in a couple of directions, eventually getting pointed to the old, legendary town drunk Zadok, who supposedly knows all the goings-on, but is, of course, the town drunk, and he's just hammered all the time. Eventually sort of screws up his courage, decides to ply Zadok with whiskey to try to get out of him, like, what the secret of the town is, if any, like why it seems so off or odd, and in fact is then almost literally vomited exposition by Zadok about the history of the town and the sort of major players and what happened, or at least what Zadok thinks or knows affected the town and why it's so odd. And then Zadok runs off in fright by something unseen, and the main character then decides to stay over one night in Innsmouth, a very poor decision, gets sort of chased through his hotel room later at night, escapes into the city, now basically in darkness and moonlit, and he is running from a gathering of denizens, which sort of a mob, gathering larger and larger, searching the town for him, scouring it for him. An escape, sort of chase and escape ensues. He escapes out to the countryside surrounding Innsmouth and is presented with something he, in true Lovecraftian fashion, something horrible that should not exist, but yet here it is presented for his very eyes. Traditionally, I would say that's about where the conclusion begins here. The intro would stop where after Zadok's exposition, which we'll get into. And then he sort of starts researching more and more, learns more about himself, his family history and tree, if you will. And then finally realizes that he himself shares ancestry and lineage with the Innsmouth people and the Innsmouth look, and in fact starts taking on the look himself, and then goes into the sea, as the people of Innsmouth do, to transform into the half-human, half-Cthulhian hybrid monster that they all are. So I think that's pretty much it, and kind of a classic. He decided, real quickly, at first he contemplates suicide, because he almost can't deal with going mad from the revelation. But then he starts turning more and decides that, nope, I will in fact rescue one of my cousins who is in an insane asylum, and we shall together return to Innsmouth, to our home and ancestry, back to the sea. So I think that's pretty much it. You guys got anything else to add or anything I may have missed?
No, you gave a pretty in-depth, but nowhere near as in-depth as
yes, I am not
Lovecraft did.
As verbose as Lovecraft.
But I need to compare this. This is my first experience with a written work of Lovecraft.
Sure.
Of course, he pervades so much of pop culture
Right.
and horror modern day. But I have to compare it to Tolkien.
Mm-hmm. I think
And
that's
I
fair.
know that Lovecraft, in the same way Tolkien is, they're in love with the mythos they're developing.
Yes.
To the point which they're more interested, they're less interested in narrative than they are in building
World building,
a world
sure.
that they envision in their mind.
I would agree with that.
And I have to give him credit for doing a good job with this because, yeah, it's dry at times, it's exposition heavy, but just by how influential he is, you can definitely see why with just the creativity that went into building the world. But the question is, does that make a good narrative?
I know you're gonna get to that. So what do you think?
I asked that question, so I'm going to let you guys.
All right. Well, what do you think, Chris?
I think the comparison to Tolkien is apt. I mean, Tolkien's really been into world building, and he wanted you to always know the history of everyone and everything and all the
And
time.
every single tree branch.
And yeah, the exposition is basically two monologues, one by the ticket taker or ticket seller, and the other one by the town drunk. And it is dry. It is a style of storytelling.
It can be dry. I will say that.
I'll tell you what makes it dry.
Okay.
It's not the exposition. It's not the history. Now, Zadok was an awesome character. However, translating turn of the 19th to 20th century New England, Rhode Island specific dialogue written out, also taking into account how people spoke back then, where, these are queer looking folk, they looked queer, it's just like, Tolkien used that a lot, and it's just a different dialect than we have here. So during Zadok's monologue, which lasts 15 pages,
I think it's
so,
like almost the whole section of
yeah.
that.
I mean, it took me a long time to get through, only because of that. It's not
Sure.
because the history wasn't interesting, and there was a lot of characters you had to keep track of in that history. But I'm agreeing with you. I'm like, narrative wise, how does that help the narrative?
So I bring up this as my prime example often of a failure in narrative. I'm a huge fan of Joseph Conrad, but there's a book called Joseph Conrad's Nostromo, which is so laden with description and with nuance that it's a detriment to the narrative.
I see what you're saying, and I can certainly see that as applied to Lovecraft and the story itself. Yes,
I think I'm going to give this a 2, strictly on the sense of how influential it is, but in a way, it just that the narrative doesn't necessarily work, especially for a story this long. It's very heavy with unnecessary kind of, but it's not. That's not the point. The narrative isn't the point of the story. It's the development of the mythos. But we're assessing narrative here.
Sure.
So I can't give it a full score, but I'm going to give it a high score of 2.
I think you might have against me there. Like, of course, in full disclosure, this is my choice, so that will be coloring my answers here and there. But I think you might be right. Like, as much as I want to give it a really good score, I think I might have to take off points here and there for very things you guys just said, and then give it a solid 2. But I don't think I agree. Like, again, and even in light of my bias, it doesn't quite reach a 3.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. Ian, you sold me on what you said. I mean, because this really was a lot about building a mythos, and it wasn't focused specifically on the story.
Sure.
So, yeah, I would definitely give it a solid 2.
Okay.
I mean, I've got some historic reasons, because this is like the 3rd time I've read it myself. And
I think it's about the same for me.
Yeah, and as Ian and I were talking, it's one of those things where, you forget about the minutia. When I look back in the story, I remember all sorts of things, but I forget about the minutia. So yeah, It's getting a solid 2.
All right. Well, that'll bring us to themes with you, Chris.
Themes. No, this one's a little difficult. I mean, obviously there's the overarching theme of identity.
Yes.
Well,
that's the main one.
Which in the world building and the history that Zadok tells, there is a lot of identity in there. I mean, there's self-identity within the people he was talking about and the relations, and then when our protagonist goes over, when he returns back to Ohio and goes over his family tree. So, it is a horror story, but I think as a central theme, something that goes through it, I'm going to consider it self-identity.
I like that one. I don't think it's invalid anyway, but allow me to introduce sort of a Cronenbergian view. I think it's sort of like body horror, if you will, because
True.
As he starts turning into, he starts acquiring the Innsmouth look, which means he's mutating essentially into a half sea creature, half human hybrid.
And he's accepting it too.
Sure. So like I said, he's of course horrified, to learn the history, learn somehow he can trace it back. His ancestry goes back to Innsmouth in a much greater way than he, of course, knew about beforehand. And then there's a section where he's looking in the mirror every day or every week, and he can see himself like acquiring like the large fishy eyes and like the bulging forehead face. So I think it's both of those, like both sort of like entwined there, self-identity and what I just said. You got anything, E? Here we go.
All right.
He's winding up.
So there's a famous theme you find in Stephen King, as you brought up, Scott brought up earlier, with like both of these are in the set in the New England. But I think it's anywhere you go, the idea of the alien versus the isolation of a group of people, and how
that's a good point.
When you go to a town, like, oh, a stranger's just showed up, like, and that kind of, even though there's a supernatural element to this, both King and Lovecraft kind of delve into this small town mindset, although often you don't really get the point of view of the townsfolk in this. Obviously, They're Lovecraftian monsters, but like where King will more delve into that psychological side, I still think the theme remains. I also find it interesting the parallel between the narrator and his ancestor, Captain Marsh, was it?
Obed Marsh, I believe, yes.
Who was also an adventurer, in a sense. They're both kind of people who went out of their, in a sense, isolated areas and, in a way, find monstrosities for that, and it infects them in a way. But maybe
that's well
not
said.
Maybe not in the sense of, like, it's legitimately being affected by this kind of monstrousness, but the idea of, like, bringing it back with you. And he, in a sense, can't escape now his past. And he's also, basically, he is the descendant of this captain. So I think there's all these, like, little touches to personality types, identity, and like the kind of nature of like the isolation of a community. So I think overall it's pretty effective.
Yeah, I may agree with that's all I said. You guys had some interesting things to say.
I mean,
things I didn't think of, but I think they're very solid.
I was thinking that we've got at least 3 interpretations of themes, plus as you was talking to us and you guys were talking, I was thinking about. So yeah, definitely one.
All right, and that'll bring us to Ia with antagonist.
Fish people?
Yeah, the denizens of Innsmouth. The shadow that is over Innsmouth, i.e., all the people who have been corrupted by the monstrous influence, if you will.
Yeah, but that's not what's... Yes, that is present. And yeah, it's hard to argue that fish people that demand human sacrifices aren't villains. But that's not really what is antagonizing the main
Sure, I mean, it
character.
is and it isn't. I think I know what you're going to say, so continue.
So, yeah, that's part of the antagonist there. But it's also, in a way, as I was bringing up in themes, kind of that history to him. That idea of, like, being drawn... His curiosity drawing him to... Just like his ancestor was. And... Oddly enough, there's kind of parallel that as an adventurer, his ancestor went out to the sea, and at the very end, he's drawn to the sea.
Sort of like a cyclical fulfillment.
So, I don't know. I think that's not being able to kind of escape that. I don't know how to describe it well right now.
No,
but
I think I know what you're saying. Sure.
I was thinking, definitely his personal history is as one of the antagonists.
The unknown secrets about yourself.
Yeah, but you were talking about a journey. I mean, what he went on this journey to, he wasn't going on a personal history, but his whole thing was to study architecture and anthropology and so forth. So he was like the tiara and so forth, like that he saw in the museum or library, and he, these things as artifacts. Like he was looking for a general history, and then found a specific history.
Yes, he's looking for one kind of history and found a completely different one. Yes,
and they were tied in together. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's one of those things where it's nebulous in terms of being an antagonist. But I mean, it was definitely there. It was very weighty and all that. So I'm going to go with his personal history or history.
It's funny you say like a nebulous. Yeah, that's what Lovecraftian monsters are. Like they're insidious, of course. I mean, I have to agree. And yeah, like I said, I'm sort of biased, but I think you guys both made good points. It sort of filtered through the light of that. Yes, even given the mythos that you said that he was building, and like sort of this is one of his later stories, so he'd already built a lot of like the foundations of it. So assuming you had read some of those, if not all, then you sort of knew like some of the aspects of it. But I still think like it's always there, and he's antagonized in some way by some of like one or more of the things you just said throughout.
There's an interesting part to this where when I think of Cthulhu, I think of him in a sense being the antagonist and being driven mad by facing something incomprehensible. This story was in a sense more like Silent Hill 2.
Yes. I sort of agree with that. And
I was going to say, I was thinking, I mean, I know Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, the town that the protagonists was influenced by this. I was also thinking about Silent Hill. I'm like, I wonder how much of Silent Hill played into this.
A bunch. Well. See, like, here's the thing, like, if nothing else, and we might get into a later question, but nevertheless, Lovecraft's reach and influence is everywhere, like, still to this day. So, I mean, I like that. I didn't think of it myself. I sort of pissed that I didn't make the Silent Hill connection, but I think you guys are right and think you could see parallels there.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give it a 1 for antagonist.
Yes,
of all
without question, yeah.
All right, and that'll bring it to me with protagonist. So sort of nameless narrator. I guess, so Ian looked up earlier precast that technically this character has a name, but since it's not mentioned in the story, I'm going to disregard that. But it is part of this character named is in the greater Lovecraft mythos, as we said. But nevertheless, he's sort of like not quite an unreliable narrator, but maybe approaches it. But like, so again, here's sort of like the caveat that this story and many others of Lovecraft, again, if not all, are sort of like a record. Like, here's what happened to me. I kept it hidden, and it's going to drive me insane. It might drive you insane, but I must get it down as a record. So it's like, it's like found articles and so forth.
Wasn't this actually, in a sense, a recording of his, I think the FBI or the police or something like that?
Yes, exactly. It's a statement to them, essentially. Sure. So it's all like basically, again, not a flashback, but like leading up to here's everything that happened to me, and here's the truth, in quotes, capital T. But I still think it's like effective, and especially to the end. So I glossed over it, so allow me to cover it here. Again, like the ending paragraph or so, something like, "And I will dwell in glory forever in the depths of the sea with my my heritage."
Yeah, he really drank the Kool-Aid.
Being a monster, yeah.
He definitely drank the Kool-Aid. What I liked about the protagonist was that even, and this is a retrotelling of what he experienced, he has a certain detachment, but as the story goes on, it becomes more and more and more personal.
The tension, I think, is ratcheted up. Yes.
Yeah, because it reminded me a lot of like the beginning of Bram Stoker's Dracula, where Jonathan Harker's going there and he has something. He goes, "I must send this recipe back to whatever his wife's name, Mia. Thank you." And there's like a certain level of detachment.
Yes, I definitely see what you're saying.
But as once the threat becomes personal, he really does internalize it. Where it's like the ending the ending of it is one of the things I remember the most, where he's, getting out of his room and trying to get out, go at the rooftops and trying to figure out how to get out of there and the train tracks. And it's very, very exciting, but all of a sudden it's very, very personal as well.
No, I agree. And actually, you just remind me of something that it's sort of like famous, the story that is that it's one of the few ones, in light of what I just said, but it has an action scene. In fact, he actively escapes from the hotel. It's a chase scene, right? It's his, like, again, his recollection, his statement, as you said, E. But in terms of narrative wise, there's an action scene, which you don't often see in Lovecraft. Some of it is literally just like records and papers and letters that are put together to create a greater story. Whereas in this, again, in the action scene through the whole town itself, and he escapes, through the railroad tracks and so forth.
And that might be one of the reasons why a lot of people have a hard time getting into Lovecraft, because there is always that kind of detachment, whether it's, your
it's a possible factor, sure.
Yeah.
For the first half of the story, maybe more than that, the main character, the unnamed narrator, is a vessel for the narration. Sure. He is simply there to
So you
build
get the
exposition
exposition as the...
Yeah.
You're right.
I actually think the point of Bram Stoker's Dracula is very good, because was Jonathan Harker?
Harker.
Yeah, he wasn't a very interesting character
No.
but later on, as the stakes rose, a lot of secondary characters became much more interesting, and like this, he does develop over the course, but because it changes from I guess a product of its time was the world building. The character's secondary, and then now we're going to focus on what happens to the character. So I'll give it a soft 1 for that, because it's kind of the time and place failure of character development for the beginning.
I see what you're saying. I might give it a solid 1. I don't think it would be a hard 1, but I still think he does a good job. Again, he's effective, and yet you follow his journey, of course, because this one is in first person. And I mean, like, you follow him into madness almost literally at the end, So all I'm saying is, like, I think he was an effective character if he wasn't the most robust character, even though he's ostensibly the narrator of the story.
I'm definitely giving it a solid, strong 1, because I was just thinking about it because when I did read this for 3 times, and it was a really beautiful day out, so I spent all morning out here reading this.
Reading Lovecraft in a sunny 70-degree day.
Actually, I was reading it by the canal down here, and I could hear, like, the fish and the frogs jumping.
You could hear the frog people?
Yeah.
The Innsmouth people?
Exactly. I still don't have the Innsmouth look, though.
Not yet.
But when I got to the action sequence, I actually found myself standing up and kind of pacing while I was reading. It was really engrossing. And another thing that I just thought of while we were talking, I'm like, I wonder if Sutter Kane there's always a somewhat of an attachment in Lovecraft, and I wonder if Sutter Kane wasn't like, well, if Lovecraft really, didn't have any kind of a detachment, if that was a thing.
Sure, you mean Sutter Kane from In the Mouth of Madness?
Yeah, because that was basically
Halloween episode. Check that out.
Yeah, because basically that whole movie is an homage to Lovecraft. Sure. But
it's Lovecraft's or Carpenter's love letter to Lovecraft, if you will.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, the fact that at the end I was pacing after I've read the book and listened to it like 3 or 4 times. Yeah, I'm definitely giving it a solid 1. He's really effective.
I think so too. All right, and I'll bring us to secondary characters with you, Chris.
Oh man, well, just on
who's the best one?
I was
think
gonna say
obvious.
Just on what's it? Oh my
Old
God.
Zadok, man.
Zadok, man. He was
no last name. He's just Zadok.
He was great.
He's like a rock star or a porn star.
His monologue was hard to get through because
you're right. Like because of the dialect and
the
way
dialect
it was
and all that
sure.
stuff. But he was a really good, effective supporting character. I mean, I did like the grocery boy, and I liked all the secondary characters, but. Even though what he was saying was dry, when you pull back and you get the narrator of it interacting with Zadok about offering the whiskey, that was really interesting. He was interesting as a character, and again we're bringing action to this. He was interesting viscerally, as you could visualize him based upon what the narrator was saying.
So I agree with that. So it's sort of like, again, it's sort of necessary that Zadok has to spit this exposition onto the narrator's face, if you will.
Yes.
But like, because you need that as a reader. Like, if you had no other context within Lovecraft's world building, then you needed at least something, and he's the vessel character for that, for sure. And like, it's sort of like comically amusing. Like, you definitely probably most people have experienced a drunken ramble from somebody in their lives about, I used to live here and blah, 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 blah.
I'm sorry, Scott. I'm the one who does the drunken rambling.
Yes, well, that's why I gave you Uncle Zadok as your alternate character name in this episode, sir. But yeah, I mean, of course, like, I just think Joe Sargent, too, like, that's the bus driver who drives him into Innsmouth.
Yeah.
Like, that's his first little taste, like, something ain't right about this guy.
And he doesn't even say anything.
Yeah, he says, like, one thing, maybe he has one line, if that. He might not say, I don't exactly
remember. I think the most you hear of him is, like, Joe said that the bus was broken, we couldn't leave tonight.
Yeah. Sure, and then you got the librarian chick that, like I said, he flirts with real quick. And then I think you got the denizens, like, the monsters, half-hybrids of Innsmouth itself, like, the collective crowd, like, as an effective mob. Like, I'll just real quickly... They made a game based upon this story back in the day. It was an original Xbox game, and I greatly enjoyed it. And it's probably the only story of Lovecraft that you can make a game from because it has action. In fact, there's a whole chapter in which you escape the Gilman house. So I thought that was pretty cool. So I just want to drop it in there, like give it a shout out. But yeah, I still think it's pretty damn effective, and the side characters round out the world and the town of Innsmouth well enough that again it's believable. Are they like the most multi-dimensional characters? No, but they don't need to be. But I still think they're believable, even if some of them are literally monsters. So I'll give it a pretty solid one again, if not a soft.
Yeah, I'm giving it a solid one.
All right, I have just a quick addendum to that. Though I think the strength of the story is in its mythos building. The world building is also fairly well done, which tied together, but still slightly different. And I think the supporting cast of this works very well for the intended.
In light of that.
Yeah, like I remember, like I don't, as you mentioned, Chris, I don't remember. I'll forget about the minutia, but I'll remember the bus driver. I'll remember Zadok.
Yeah.
Like he has an art for creating interesting secondary characters, and of all of the protagonists, antagonists, his supporting characters are the strongest there. So
Fair enough.
All
right, and that'll bring us to dialogue with you, E.
I have a quick thing to say about this, and then I'll pass it along. I don't care what anyone else says. They should have renamed Exposition Dump Lovecraftian Dump, because mein Gott,
sure,
is there just so much
he actually
awful dialogue.
He's actually older than Tolkien, so you couldn't call it Tolkien Dump. It was definitely low.
I can't give it
that's really
anything
funny.
but a 0 for this, because like even if characters had good dialogue, just the sheer amount of dialogue solely for the sake of giving you background or like it's infuriating. So I have to give it a 0.
Fair enough.
A strong 0.
I can see. So like, I may have to do that myself, but not for the same reasons, or at least not to the extent that you feel them. It seems. Not that I'm saying it's infuriating, but like I will have to agree at the end of the day, like, yeah, it's in service again to the world building, to like the theme and so forth. It's in service to other things, so therefore it is quite dry. Yeah, like you said, it's funny. Like, yeah, they might as well rename Exposition Dump to Lovecraft, like spitting his mythos in your face via like a random character. So like, yeah, I mean, like, of course, I'm sure he intended it as a sort of colloquial version. Like, yeah, this is how an old drunk New England person would speak if you're talking to him. But does that make it good? Like, is it enjoyable? I just don't think it's strong enough. Even other dialogue beyond that.
Attaching like the thing about like a paint job on a car doesn't make it a new car.
If I paint a tiger on my van, it's not like awesome.
Putting an accent on Exposition Dump doesn't make it good dialogue. Like,
sure, it might be in quotes more realistic, but is it enjoyable to read or like go through or like, try to parse out? I think I may have to agree, even though, again, like, I very much love this story and Lovecraft in general. I think in this instance, and probably you could apply this broadly, it's one of the weakest parts of his writing. So I'll have to give it, if not a soft 0, again, just a middle-of-the-road 0, which is not quite enough.
It's weird, because I really didn't know what to number this after hearing both of you guys. But I
got convinced either way.
Yeah, and you guys are... This is going to be funny because I wasn't sure I was going to give it, but I'm actually going to give it a 1.
All right.
Yeah, fair enough.
And because the problem was I didn't feel frustrated with it. It was dry, but it kind of reminded me a lot. And of course, since Carpenter's really influenced by Lovecraft, it reminded me of John Huston's
amongst
character
others, sure,
at the beginning of The Fog, where he's telling the story of the, and I just kept thinking of somebody like that. And I'm like, thinking about the time this was written and so forth. I'm like, it's dry, but it wasn't unpleasant. So I'm going to give it a 1.
That's fair enough, and that'll bring me to style. So it's funny, like, I'm going to fall on the heels of what you just said. But instead of my own words, I will give you the quote on the back of the book of the collection that I have for Lovecraft stories. It says, "If you look at the way critics describe Lovecraft, they often say he's purple, overwritten, overblown, verbose, but it's kind of unputdownable," which is a word I'm assuming they invented. "There's something about that kind of hallucinatory, intense prose which completely breaches all rules of, in quote, good writing, but is somehow utterly compulsive and affecting." And I think that's better than I could have phrased it, why I like Lovecraft. Yes, on the surface, he can be dry, and everything we just said about some of the dialogue, and even like other parts, like the descriptions and so forth. However, there's something about it that like sort of like worms into your mind, to me at least, in a good way. It's enjoyable, even if it seems at first you're like, this is kind of dry, like, but it's sort of like insidiously like builds upon itself, and just, if not driving you mad, it's still effective. It's, again, breaks the rules of, in quotes, good writing, but somehow is affecting for that. So that's all pretty much my argument.
It's like, Lovecraft to me is kind of like one of my 20-year-old t-shirts that has holes in it that feels so comfortable, or like that old blanket you had. I mean, his world, and you said insidious well, because what's great about him is, you know, there may be holes in it, you know, I mean, like there may be dry parts. It may not be like a perfect seam, but you can envelop yourself in it so well, you know, and then once he envelops you, you know, your mind is his to play with.
Then you're in the mouth of madness.
Yeah, you're
bitch.
in the mouth of madness. So yeah.
And I don't have the nostalgic viewpoint you guys have about it, but I recognize it for being a writing style of a certain time and place. Yeah, again, I'm going to bring up the Tolkien response. Yeah, like there are certain people who will prefer George R. R. Martin style of writing over Tolkien style of writing, but they're written a century apart, or sort of
roughly
around that.
Yeah.
It's a relic of its day and age, and I can recognize that, and I can forgive it for that, because it does it effectively, even though perhaps a modern audience might
be more removed from it or something.
Yeah, as the points you guys are making, like the thing is, the mythos holds up, if not the style necessarily, but the style is not as offensive to weigh down the importance of it. So I'm going to give it a 1.
Yeah, me too. And I think you answered the best question, you know, as to why do very few of his adaptations work. You either do something like Mouth of Madness, which is which is a love letter to Lovecraft, or you do like Stuart Gordon's From Beyond, or what was that? What were we just talking about? Reanimator.
Yes.
Where you kind of move it into a different world, or you take something like Stuart Gordon made a really great version of this called Dagon.
Dagon, yes.
Dagon,
which is referenced in
the
Shadows.
esoteric order of Dagon.
Yep.
And it was a modern day setting, and it was actually set. It was filmed in Portugal. I don't know if it was set there, but it was a different take. So it was the same story, just in a different time period, with minor things around. Like he was there with his fiance, and she. Well, I don't want to spoil the film, but it was. So what I'm saying is, but any other adaptation of Lovecraft seems to either be a success or a complete and utter and horrible failure.
No, I agree. And I guess my only final point upon this is that there's a reason why his name still and influence it still persists to this day. If it was truly that bad and forgettable, then he would have been forgotten as a writer. But I think there's enough there that he sort of gained more fame after his death, and sort of like people latched onto it. Even like, and like you said, Chris, people picking parts that they liked and kind of making their own thing, but nevertheless still grounded in his like general mythos and mindset and world. And so
right,
I'm give it a 1.
You cannot directly adapt him.
Yep, I agree. All right, brings us to finally recommendation with you, Chris.
Oh yeah, hell yeah! I absolutely would recommend this. I've been recommending this for 20 years now, so yeah.
I'm gonna give it a very strong recommendation with a caveat.
All right, interesting from you, E.
If you're interested in Lovecraft, of course, read this, and Lovecraftian horror type things. If you are a fan of horror in general, and if you are of the mindset, like, if you can read Tolkien and appreciate it for being how influential it was on fantasy, then you'll be able to read Lovecraft and see how influential it have been on horror.
Because he has some fantastic elements in him, too.
Yes, but like, I think they have, in a sense, to their respective genres, have an equal importance. If you are have modern day sensibilities of wanting to read James Patterson or Dan Brown, yes, then you're not gonna be able to get through this. But we're not. Our podcast isn't really talking to you.
We're not geared towards you, so fuck off. Really.
So it's very it kind of has historical weight to it beyond just being also readable. So. That's my. I
mean, I pretty much agree. Of course, like as our tradition is, I did recommend this. This is my pick for MOTS Ado for Halloween, so of course I'm going to recommend it. But I would say, like, if you have no experience with Lovecraft, or again have heard of him but never actually read any of his things, this is probably one that's good to start with.
Yes.
And if you have and somehow missed this one, then of course read it. And if you read it again because it still holds up.
Okay, I'm going to give a caveat to your caveats because I make fun of Dan Brown.
That's a Lovecraftian caveat, man.
Yes, it's only because you gave me a couple pages of his to read and I couldn't get through it. But be that as it may, I also like fluff. I love this stuff, but I'm the kind of person who used to pick up like those Star Trek: The Next Generation or Star Trek novels that the non-canon stuff. And it's not, at the end of the day, that's not like great literature.
Sure.
But by the same token, it's enjoyable. So. I don't want to say if you only like a certain style of writing, then you probably wouldn't like this. But it's also okay to read fluff.
Sure. I mean, I don't think it's quite fluff, but I know what you mean. But like, it's sort of like even when Lovecraft was writing himself contemporarily, he submitted to like pulp mag, like Weird Science or like Weird Tales of Fiction, whatever. Like that's sort of like where he came from. And sure, it's sort of like the Penny Dreadful kind of stuff. But like I said, and as we all covered. There's a reason why this stuff still persists and is so popular to this day, and this, I think, is one of his well-known and most well-done stories.
I actually think for like even the dry parts, this is probably one of his most accessible too.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. So, just real quick, another just random fact: the collection I just got, it was a new collection, came out last month at the time of this recording, and it puts his stories in chronological order. So, Shadow over Innsmouth is one of the last ones. I think you can sort of see the progression, like. It's like one of his, later stories in which he was comfortable with himself. He knew what he was doing, what he wanted to do, what his style was, again, like how he wanted to formulate it. And I think that's why it's so good, because he had built up to it, and it's one of the best standout ones. All right, so that's the scores in, and E will give us the final breakdown.
All right, so Scott and me gave it a 8, and Chris gave it a 9. Giving an overscore of an 8.3333.
Yeah, damn right. It's damn solid. Maybe not for everybody, but I still think it's worth reading if you have any interest or affinity to this kind of stuff whatsoever.
To me, if you're going to read one Lovecraft story, this would probably be the one I'd recommend.
Yeah, it's one of the 2 or 3, but definitely up there. And
to be honest with you, I think the action scene at the end actually really is one of the strongest parts of it. So if anything else, you get to that last part, and the last 20 pages of this are really well paced. So
yeah, I agree. All right, well, that'll do it for MOTS Ado this evening. I, of course, am Scott Thurlow, and I must go dive into the sea to be with my fission brethren. I've been here with Chris Morgan.
I'll take the sea any time of the day of the week.
All right, and Jonathan Ian Manzer.
And I'll take the mountains of madness.
All right, we'll see you there. Good night.
MOTS Ado About Nothing. MOTS Ado About Nothing. Music by Chris Morgan.
Editing and engineering by Scott Thurlow.
MOTS Ado About Nothing.
This has been a Los Angeles production. All rights reserved.